I imagine most of you will know who this guy is. Even before he was the President of the United States, Donald Trump was a pretty well-known person because of his appearance on reality TV shows and being such a big property mogul in New York City. He was a pretty well-known individual. There's a lot that's been said about him, particularly in recent years since he's been President of the USA. And so lots of people have an opinion about the kind of person he is. A lot of people have a lot to say about who he is. He's a pretty polarising person. Some people love him, some people really can't stand him. And so while we might know who he is, I think most people have an opinion about who Donald Trump is as well. But I wonder sometimes who he is at the end of the day, when the reporters have gone home and he's finished doing his presidential work for the day and he's wearing his slippers and dressing gown in front of the TV, firing off those tweets criticising different world leaders. I wonder who he is. Because you see, there's a difference between knowing about a man like Donald Trump, knowing his past, his history, his policies, his presidential style, love him or hate him. It's one thing to know about him, but to actually know him, to know who he is underneath all those layers that we tend to have as individuals, to know what's at his heart, what makes him who he is, that's something completely different. You see, we don't know who a person is just by their actions. We don't know who a person is by reading their tweets or watching the news about them or hearing reports or magazine articles about them. We know who a person is by being in relationship with them, by listening to them, by talking to them, by asking them questions, by engaging in conversation and just being in their presence. And so I might know about Donald Trump, but I wonder how many people actually really know him. Now, I'm going to put him off to the side because, again, some people love him, some people will be wondering, why have you got a picture of Donald Trump in your message this week? I wanted to use him as an example because he is a very well-known person and a kind of person that a lot of people talk about and have opinions about. And I wanted to use him as a way of contrasting the difference between knowing about an individual and actually knowing them. Because there's a story in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 16, verses 13 to 20, where this whole distinction between knowing about a person and really knowing a person is highlighted by some questions of Jesus. You see, Matthew 16, verses 13 to 20, Jesus is with his disciples and he asks them, "Who do people say I am?" He's asking his disciples to tell him what people are saying about him. People who may have heard reports about what Jesus was doing, or people who may have even seen or heard some of the things he was doing. Jesus is asking a question about what people say about him based on what they know about him. And so the disciples offer a range of suggestions about what different people are saying. But then Jesus asks another question. And this becomes one of the most important questions that we can ask ourselves, or we can hear Jesus asking us as his followers, as Christians. Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" It's genius. The questions that Jesus is asking are absolutely brilliant. Because in just these two questions, he goes from a kind of theoretical knowledge about him, and in the second question makes this a very personal question. This isn't just about information about him. This isn't just based on reports about him. But he's asking his disciples who've been travelling with him, who've been closely connected with him, who have known him personally, who have been in relationship with him during the time that they've followed him. He's asking them to look in their hearts and their souls and say, "Yeah, but what about you? There are all these reports and rumours and stories about me, but what about you? Who do you say I am?" And this question kind of pierces beneath all these layers of reports and rumours and stories and talk. It gets beyond just talking about a person, and it asks his disciples and as it asks us to really reflect on the relationship we have with Jesus and how we know him personally. Because you see, the Christian faith isn't just about intellectual knowledge. It's not just about theology or doctrines or content. And look, I know that they have an important part in the passing on of the faith, that we can't know somebody unless we know about them. And so this talk about Jesus, technically we call that the study of theology. This talk about Jesus, and we're all theologians, anyone who's talking about Jesus is a theologian, it's important and it has its place. But that's not the goal. The goal of the Christian faith is to actually listen to the question that Jesus is asking us about who we say he is, and to ask ourselves, well, who is he to me? Who is this Jesus person? And yes, we will rely on some information. We'll rely on theology and doctrine and these this information we have about Jesus in order to do that. But it takes us or brings us into a different space. It's actually asking us to think about who Jesus is to us in a personal way, in a relational way, in the same way that, you know, there's a difference between knowing about Donald Trump and actually knowing him personally. Jesus is asking his disciples to make this transition from what other people are saying about him to who they believe he is. Because their faith in Jesus, who they trust him to be, who they believe him to be, is reflected in the way that they answer this question. In the same way, the way that we know Jesus, the way that we believe in him, the way that we trust him, the kind of person that Jesus is to us will be reflected in the way that we answer this question of who do we say Jesus is? And so Jesus invites us past the theology, past the doctrine, past the stories about him, and invites us into a personal relationship with him. Now, I know that's kind of Christianese jargon. I know that people talk about a personal relationship with Jesus. And I think it's worthwhile actually stopping and thinking about, what does that look like? When we talk about a personal relationship with Jesus, what do we mean by that? Because the reality that I believe in, because I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, is that Jesus isn't just some historical figure who lived a long, long time ago in a land far, far away. But he is a real, living, breathing, flesh and blood person. Because I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, I believe that Jesus is alive. And so he just doesn't want me to think about him as an idea, but he wants us to think about him as a real living person with whom we can enter into a relationship. Now, the way in which we get to know Jesus is the same way we get to know anybody personally, by spending time with them, by listening to what they say to us. And this is why, it's really important that I believe we don't just read the Bible as a textbook, but we actually read it as a living Word of God through which God speaks to us in Christ through his Spirit. So we're learning to listen to what God says to us in Jesus. And so the same way we get to know somebody, by listening to them, by talking to them in prayer, by spending time in them, actually making time in our lives to actually be with them, either individually or in community. This is what it means to get to know him, to be involved personally with him. Because the more we enter into this personal relationship with Jesus, the more we understand that he is a living, breathing, flesh and blood person who invites us into this relationship through faith, the more we'll be able to answer this question. Now, I'm intrigued with Peter's answer. I wonder whether Peter sat there and he thought about it and he got his theology all lined up and he thought about what the Old Testament said about Jesus, and he used all this jargon in order to try to give the correct theological understanding of the person of the Christ. I don't think he did. I think the way that Jesus responds by saying, "Blessed are you because our Father in heaven has revealed this to you," I think Peter's response was just a natural response based on what he'd seen, based on what he'd witnessed based on the time he'd spent with Jesus and what he saw Jesus doing and the person that he knew Jesus to be. I don't think he was going into this as a theological exercise, but because he knew Jesus, he knew who he was to him, and so God gave him this answer, which was from the heart and honest and sincere, that he was the Christ, he was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. This answer was based on what he'd experienced in relationship with Jesus, what he'd experienced by spending time with Jesus, the difference that Jesus had made in the lives of the people he'd seen, but also the difference that Jesus had made in Peter's life. And so his answer, I think, was honest, it was heartfelt, it was sincere. It wasn't necessarily the correct answer, but it was a real answer. And in the same way, I believe that when Jesus asks us, who do we say he is? I don't think he's looking for a nice, theological, doctrinally correct answer. I mean, again, those things can guide us into a deeper understanding of who Jesus is as we live in relationship with him. But he's not looking for a correct answer. I think he's looking for a real answer. And that's, where I think this is an important question for all of us to actually think about, well, who is this Jesus that we know? Who is this Jesus who invites us into a relationship with him? Who is this Jesus who gives his life for us on the cross, who has risen again from the dead, who pours himself into us through his word and through his sacraments, connecting us with him and all the goodness of God that he embodies? How do we understand him? And how do we understand his role in our life? And how do we understand who he is to us in a real personal sense? And so as we reflect on this question, as a pastor, I'm not looking to sort of evaluate your answer and make sure you give the right answer, kind of like we did in confirmation years ago, but to give us a chance to pause and reflect and think about the person, Jesus, and not just who he was, but who he is and the difference that he can make in our lives. There is a real difference between knowing about Donald Trump and knowing him personally. I would really encourage you, if you've spent your life just knowing about Jesus, learning about his teachings and reading about him in the Bible and all the stuff that we do, I would encourage you to try to change that mindset and to see Jesus, to think of Jesus, to understand of Jesus as a real flesh and blood person who gave his life for you on the cross, who is risen again from the dead, who is a part of your life and who wants to be a growing part of your life, who then comes to you and says, what about you? Who do you say I am? And if you're stuck for an answer, if you don't know how to answer that, I encourage you to get to know him, to spend time with him, to listen to what he's saying to you, or to learn to listen to what he's saying to you, to talk to him honestly and openly in prayer, to grow to know him, not just about him, but to grow to know him the way we grow to know anyone in relationship. So that as we do that, as members of the living, breathing body of Jesus in the world, we can not only grow in our relationship with each other, but we can grow in this relationship with Jesus, who sacrificed everything out of love for us and whose love for us is even stronger than death, as we see in his resurrection. Because he wants to know you and he wants you to know him, so that as we know him rather than just knowing about him, we can find his blessing, his grace, his love, all the goodness of God which he pours into our lives. And then we grow in that relationship. Then when people ask us, who do you say Jesus is? We have an answer for the hope we have. God bless you. God keep you in relationship with Jesus. God help you know this amazing person, Jesus, in your life.